There are many good books on autism, and these are just a few that come to mind, which really help me to get an overall picture of my own experience and how to better reframe it in a not so disabling, invalidating, or even devaluing way, but seeing it just as another way of experiencing and being highly impacted by the environment, more so than the predominant neurotype. We neurodivergent folks are in the minority, and this world wasn't designed for us. So of course it is a challenge and will always be. And it is important to acknowledge to yourself that it is a challenge, validating your own experience.
Getting to know myself, really getting to know my own character, getting to know all these different sides or parts of me, things that previously were buried. There was a lot buried beneath the surface, a lot of sides of myself that I didn't know, that I wasn't in touch with, that I couldn't read. This was because those sides were unacceptable in my family system, unacceptable to my parents, unacceptable to the world that was connected to my parents, to my school system, to university, even to many of my friends, my social milieu. These sides had to be pushed down. Primarily, these were sides that were connected to my unresolved traumas, parts of me that had been traumatized that were forced down, a lot of my post-traumatic feelings, a lot of, let's say, sadness and anger, unmet needs connected to my unresolved traumas. A lot of this was just pushed down out of my sight, out of my consciousness. And what this left me with, when I was disconnected with those parts of myself, it left me with a certain, I don't know what you'd call it, a blindness in a way for knowing myself. And by extension, I couldn't see a lot of these similar parts in other people. My denial of parts of myself extended to denial of others. And in that way, I read other people, and myself primarily, more in 2 dimensions, not in 3 dimensions. Well, for starters, with knowing myself better, I went through a grieving process. And in this grieving process, it was a process of reclaiming those split off sides of me. Feeling all those ancient buried historical feelings, unacceptable feelings often, having a lot of memories come back. And it was like, I was like a dry river canyon that had been dammed up, and the dam was now breaking, and all this water and life was flowing back into me, and it flowed into my face, and it flowed through my eyes. But what happened through this was that I got to connect with these parts of me on a feeling level. And I think of it in terms of really, I think this is the primary way that I learned to read myself better. I saw it in the mirror, but even just feeling it inside myself with no actual vision at all, I could feel those feelings in my mouth and in my eyes, around my eyes and the skin around my eyes, but literally in my eyes. I could feel my sadness. I could feel, anguish. And I also felt the joy of returning to myself. And it was like these feelings of coming back to me, the physical sensations of myself coming back to me were stamped into my memory so deeply. It was like these parts of me were always me. They always had been there. But having been split off for so long, it was like returning to a connection with an ancient friend who I loved so much, who loved me so much, who was me. And what happened after having gone through this process and during going through this process was that I began to be able to read so many other things in people that previously had been denied me. And I could see it in their eyes and I could see it in their mouth. And I remember early on being very open and talking about these things and watching people get very angry and get ashamed and get frustrated and deny what I was saying. That's not true. And many, many times later, learning that it was true. And sometimes people even came back to me and said, oh my God, things you said were correct. Another thing was that now having this newfound, and I called it a gift, this newfound gift of being able to better read people, I realized that other people with whom I talked about it often didn't like it. They denied it. No, you're not correct. That's not correct what you're saying about that person. Sometimes people even said, that's not true what you're saying about your own self. Like, I remember talking with my parents sometimes about things I was discovering about myself. No, that's not true. You're reading yourself incorrectly. That's just a phase you're going through. You don't feel that way. You don't think that way. And it was like, wow, the world also wanted to read me incorrectly. And when I started reading myself more correctly, I threatened them. So it's a dangerous gift to be able to read people better. It's a gift that holds a lot of power. It can really threaten people's denial, upset the apple cart of their view of the world, of their view of themselves, knowing what had been done to me and my birthright of having my feelings about what had been done to me. And I'm talking the bad stuff that was done to me, the violations, the harm, the traumas, the neglect, the abuse. By really seeing who they were, a full three-dimensional picture of their characters, their history, their personalities, their truth and their lies, their healthy sides and their dishonesty, to see it all, even though they never saw it, they largely didn't see it. By being able to see this, it changed something in the way I was able to read people in the outside world. And what I've come to realize is that when I was in denial of so many different sides of my parents, when I was fundamentally unable to see them in 3 dimensions and just only able to see certain parts of them that were palatable to the family system, I transferred this denial onto other people. I got fooled by other people in the same way that I had been fooled by my parents. I needed to be fooled by other people. I couldn't read their character because if I read who they really were in 3 dimensions, it would betray my parents. And so by protecting my parents, by protecting the sides of myself on the inside that were like my parents, I was vulnerable in the world, vulnerable to people who didn't share who they really were, perhaps didn't even know who they really were, or sometimes people who were even very manipulative, who lied about who they were. They knew who they were, they knew what they were hiding, but they didn't want to present it. And so by really getting to know my parents better, this painful, terrible process of waking up and seeing so many ugly things that I didn't want to know, so many imperfections that I didn't want to know, to revolutionize my view of my own history and where I came from, and of the people who I once thought I loved most in the world. It was like a veil was lifted, and I could much more easily see the truth in other people.
Autism and spirituality. Psyche, self, and spirit in people on the autism spectrum. It is a common assumption that as a result of their neurological, cognitive, and social challenges, people on the autism spectrum are unable to comprehend the meaning and significance of spirituality and religious experiences. Oh my gosh, this is so... really, I really sometimes wonder what goes on in people's heads. How can they even assume that just because we have a different perception, we have no grasp on spirituality? I would say it's the other way around. Olga Bogdashina argues persuasively that the spiritual development of those on the autism spectrum is in fact way ahead of that of their neurotypical peers. She describes differences in sensory perceptual, cognitive, and linguistic development that make spiritual and religious experience come more easily to those on the autism spectrum, and presents a coherent framework for understanding the routes of spiritual development and spiritual intelligence of giftedness within this group. Using research evidence and many real examples to illustrate her hypotheses, she suggests practical ways of supporting the spiritual needs of people on the autism spectrum and their families. This book gives a voice to both verbal and non-verbal individuals on the autism spectrum, whose spiritual and religious experiences, though unconventional, are meaningful and profound. Yeah. And if you compare this to what people experience on psychedelics, then you understand. And of course, it's unconventional because normally in the limited perception we all have, where everything is filtered out, you don't experience that. But once the filters are taken down, like psychedelics normally do, then you see something a bit different, which is why neurodivergent people who have less filtering logically would perceive more of such non-ordinary states of consciousness, right? That seems only logical. However, if you have been, as neurodivergent person, also traumatized, your personhood denied, you have been gaslit about what you experience, your perception has been invalidated, then it can definitely happen that you split off a lot. And when you are stressed all the time, that connection to your true self is also limited. And to me, it was so helpful to work with Amanita Muscaria, exactly to help retrieve those exiled parts, retrieve those painful memories, but in a way that I could deal with in a sort of titration, just tiny drops to digest, look at, feel the emotion, go through the memory, integrate it, bit by bit by bit. And I'm still working on it, I'm not done yet. But it's really very important that you acknowledge to yourself that what has happened to you was traumatizing to you, regardless if anybody else says, oh, come on, that's not really traumatizing. But to you it was. Trauma is very individual. So anything that is so stressful that it is overwhelming, it is traumatic, regardless. And then again, as Daniel Mackler said, so many people are in denial about their own trauma and cannot see it in themselves. So of course they will disregard and invalidate your experience, your trauma, because it's maybe too painful for them to look at their pain. But then it is very important for you to acknowledge, to validate, to verify that this has happened to you and that it was traumatic. So Amanita Muscaria really helps you to become your own therapist. And it's very important work that you can do. Even with microdosing, it brings up all those exiled parts, helps integrate it, so you become a whole person again. Before all that happened to you,